Well, Sue, I really appreciate you taking time out from a busy schedule to be with me today and to talk about a topic I think that you are interested in, and that is the Blessed Virgin Mary. In fact, you were very kind to come to our parish recently and to talk a little bit about that topic. How did that work, by the way?
I was there with some of the RCIA people, and they were very receptive. I found them not at any point zero. They certainly knew of Mary, some more than others, and are ready to embrace her place as they enter the Catholic Church, because she certainly has significant, long-standing sacred space in our lives.
That is for sure, and I find it interesting that there is a renewed sort of interest in the Blessed Virgin Mary. One of the things that really struck me is the August 11th, 1991 issue of the New York Times Book Review has on its very front page a review of a book about Mary. It's called Encountering Mary. This is a book that both you and I have read, Encountering Mary by Sandra Zimdars-Swartz, which talks about the various apparitions of Mary. It's an excellent work. She's a professor at the University of Kansas. I've talked to her on the phone but never met her. But it was fascinating about this is that it's a front page review of the New York Times. Now, that in itself is something to be looked at. That suggests this tremendous interest that we have in Mary and in the apparitions today.
Right, and I agree. Mary, again, is getting up front center. I look back many, many years ago, prior to Vatican II, where Mary had her place. The rosary was a part of every household. Vatican II somewhat waned that interest, but I see mushrooming all over. I see it in the visits with the patients at the hospital at Mercy, where I serve as pastoral care director. A real interest, and I think it's an exciting time. I think back to my own grandmother, who used to say, "Susan, stay close to the Blessed Virgin Mary. She's a woman, she'll understand." So I'm not surprised it would make the front page, Jim. It's the right moment for it.
I think that's true, and I have noticed lately a number of people who have gone back to saying the Rosary. I think there was a time after Vatican II when that devotion was not as popular. I'm not saying it's greatly popular these days, but I have been amazed at the number of people I've met lately who told me that they have gone back to saying it. They might say it in the car as they're going on trips, as used to happen in my family, I know. And others are saying the Rosary in relationship to people, their loved ones who are sick, praying for them. Some people are using it as a way of trying to stay calm and deal with the pressures of life. So I think you see a renewed interest in that particular Marian devotion.
Yes. I found it interesting when I read a book on Medjugorje by Wayne Weibel that the Rosary, even as a Protestant person, became a significant way of touching in with the mysteries of God through the different decades and all. So that was
I remember saying as we went through the post-Vatican II time that the Rosary would come back. That's one prediction I did have right, I think, long ago, among many that were wrong, but I predicted it would come back because such repetitive prayers are part of the world's great religious traditions. Right. They've always been used, and it has sort of a psychological aspect to it where it is calming, and the repetitive prayer allows space for reflection and meditation, and I suspect that that's how some people are using the Rosary these days.
Interesting, when I first learned about the Rosary back when I was a child, I remember one of the sisters saying that it was the way that persons who were not highly educated could pray the Psalms. There's 150 Hail Marys to match the Psalms. Of course, one doesn't have to be illiterate. Some of the most brilliant people opt to make use of this sacred devotion.
That's true. In Kenneth Woodward of Newsweek, he's the religion editor for Newsweek, did the review of Sandra Zimdars-Swartz's book Encountering Mary in the New York Times, and he is he says, according to some tabulations, there have been 20,000 assorted sightings of the Virgin Mary over the last 2,000 years. So that this claim of apparitions really has happened a great deal, and I think that one of them we want to begin to look at as we go through our discussion is what happened at Lasalette in France back in 1846. There were two shepherd children who reported a single meeting with the Virgin Mary. There was the youngsters were 15 and 11.
Right.
So I think it was Melanie was the one name. She was 15 years old when this happened, and Maximin, a young lad of 11.
Mm-hmm.
This is not unusual in the apparitions. It very often happens to young people.
To younger children
Yeah.
and poor peasant people.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that occurred to them back in 1846.
Yes, And so it was interesting. One of the things that Sandra does in her book is try to look at the evolution of the understanding of the appearances. In other words, she points out that at the beginning, after they had the vision, they tended to interpret it in terms of family violence.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these children were from troubled homes. I guess they knew their share of violence, and somehow whenever they had this vision or this deep religious experience, that it was interpreted in those terms. And this becomes a common element that we find in many of the apparitions in the 19th and 20th centuries. That is, when the seers first have this religious experience, they aren't sure how to name it. They don't know who it is they have seen, and they interpret it in various ways. And as time goes on, often with the help, I might say, of local clergy persons or friends, they are helped to see who this visionary person that they have encountered really is. In this case, they gradually, over a period of time, began to identify this person as the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Right. Interesting, as it occurred to them that one of them was ready to give whatever this creature was a whack. They just weren't sure where that was coming from. And then sometimes they're embarrassed to say it out loud, the scorn that some of them have received, including the two children we're referring to, from their families. And yet they couldn't deny what they did, and the Church very, very readily got into discerning it. I sometimes think of the apparition itself as like a pebble that drops in the water, and then suddenly it starts to ripple out, and it moves far and beyond what that initial experience was for either of them.
That is so true, and that it goes outward in a number of ways, doesn't it? For one thing, it begins to involve the seers' families. Mm-hmm. Because they have to figure out what to do with it. And at times, we know in the history of these apparitions in the 19th and 20th century especially, that families have not understood or been opposed to it, or their parents have accused them of lying
Mm-hmm.
or something. So that's one element. I don't know if you want
Right.
to comment further on that in this situation about how these youngsters did with their families. But
they struggled because of the violence that was in their family anyway, and began to call it alleged apparitions and the like, but beyond that.
Yeah, well, then it also flows into the local church, doesn't it? Because then they usually get involved in parishes or the priests involved, and then it flows out eventually to the bishop, because in the Catholic community it is the local bishop who really is in charge of authenticating such things, of saying whether the church really sees this as a credible kind of event or not.
Right. Interesting, in this particular one, this event happened in 1846. It was only 5 years later that the Church did affirm that. And, of course, with this apparition as well as with others, we're dealing with the private revelation. And the Church does not require or request that we give the assent of Catholic faith, but that of human faith. So we're not dealing with a doctrinal or dogmatic addition to revelation. At the same time, it certainly is an enrichment of faith, and
Yes.
that's an important aspect of our faith, too.
Yes. I guess we would talk about it more in terms of the general category of popular devotion, the way the faith is carried out within the home and in private prayer and so on. Although, as you have pointed out, the whole thing becomes quite public because of the ripple effect. I like your image very much of it's like a pebble, the original experience, but then it keeps rippling out. And I think we're trying to explore that now in terms of family and then the local church, and how the bishop reacts, in this case, rather swiftly, as church matters go, to authenticating this or saying it is a credible kind of religious experience. But then you also have the ripple effect in terms of the public. That is, one of the characteristics, again, of the apparitions of the 19th and 20th century is that other people get involved. They go to these shrines or where the visionaries see the Virgin Mary and participate in it in some way. It becomes a prayerful place or a pilgrimage spot, a way for them to deepen their own faith.
And that is seen probably in some of the later apparitions at Lourdes or Fatima or in our own day Medjugorje. But back at Lasalette, I mean, it was, I think it launched something. There had been very few Marian apparitions until, let me see when it goes back to, way back in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, there was a lot of interest in Mary in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages. And my own recollection is that sort of slacked off in the 16th century, the time of the Protestant Reformation. And again, that's an important thing to see, that a lot of this has to do with cultural factors, these apparitions. In the Protestant Reformation period, of course, we were hearing a strong message of simplicity in the faith, of getting back to the essentials, of remembering that Christ is the one mediator, of trying to get back to the great Reformation cry was grace alone, faith alone, and Scripture alone. And so the church had to respond to that in some way and was influenced by it. And so you get a simpler kind of piety in one way and a more Christocentric piety that is centered on Jesus Christ. So evidently the Marian devotions responded to that kind of cultural phenomenon and were not as prevalent at that time. No. And I locate it more than in the 19th century that we began to see more of this.
Right. And there was a great, social and political turmoil in France right around that time, and the French monarchy was trying to be reestablished too. So, but here are these two dear children being favored in this way, and they also were given a secret, and the whole phenomenon of being drawn. What is the secret?
What is the secret?
Yes. But
I think I want to pick up a point you said there. Evidently, these are two shepherd children. They're very poor and peasant type people, not educated. And this is again a rather common phenomenon in the apparitions. The people who see Mary are usually unsophisticated kind of people with a very simple faith. That would be a general rule here. And I think the other point that you made about the crisis times within the culture also plays a role, I think. That very often the apparitions of our more recent times have occurred within situations where there's been political upheaval and economic problems, and the world has generally been seen to be in crisis. So there's a lot of that connected in, I think, with these Marian devotions.
Right. And of course, once the youngsters grew up, they lived rather nondescript lives. I think the young man tried all kinds of different careers, including priesthood, and did not follow through there. And Melanie tried to establish an order of the Mother of God, and that did not really go too far. But after her death, the missionaries of the Lasalette order was more promulgated, and that remains today the largest order trying to promote devotion to the Virgin of Lasalette.
What order is this again?
The Missionaries of Lasalette. She started one called the Order of the Mother of God that I don't believe flourished, but the other did come up. So,
well, now that's an interesting thing you bring up about their future lives and so on, and how that all went and how they responded to this particular thing. So your main point there was that they were not terribly successful people in terms of worldly success. The young man, as you pointed out, did try to become a priest, and evidently for various reasons was not able to accomplish that.
Right.
And but that brings up a general phenomenon of apparitions again. Very often the seers are sort of presumed to move towards the religious life, so that the young women involved, I think in a number of cases, have become members of religious orders and so on. And so maybe that's sort of a general thrust we find in these apparitions also. What are we going to say else about these young? There was an event that is not totally clear in my mind, but the young man, Maximin, at one time went to see St. John Vianney, the curé of Ars.
Yes.
And that became sort of controversial because I guess the curé of Ars began to think that indeed the young man had lied about the whole thing, about the fact that he had seen the Blessed Virgin Mary. And then and evidently, I think, tried to discredit the whole idea of the apparition. Now, this sets up a little conflict, and it's sort of a linkage point for a lot of people who know the famous parish priest, St. John Vianney, and the curé of Ars, as he's known.
For some reason, that does not bother me. Truth will prevail in the end. You count on that. And there are struggles. You're dealing with something that's not an everyday event. And granted, there was a misunderstanding there, but life goes on, and faith continues and deepens. So.
But Sue, let me go back to another point you made about the secrets. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but it is worth noting that they were entrusted with secrets, which becomes a regular feature of the apparitions, and then it becomes a question of do they tell or not.
Right.
And I know that Sandra Zimdar-Swartz points out in her book that these young people became very adept at fending off the people who tried to find out their secrets. They said, well, you'll have to tell it in confession. And the young man says, well, no, it doesn't have anything to do with sin. And then they said, well, you have to tell the Pope. And he said, well, he's not even going to tell the Pope either. Yeah,
and
go ahead.
Interesting, Maximin was more willing to tell the Pope in person, but Melanie was more reticent because she said, it's not the Pope who's requesting these secrets, it's the other persons who have told him to ask for it. So they were trying to be very protective. They were threatened quite a bit, and they were, finally though, I think it was Maximin who came to believe that to obey the Pope is not to disobey the Virgin. So if it was made clear enough that he was to share that, but everybody's holding their breath as to what this is. What this is.
And so the way I get the story, then, that I mean, they eventually do make this known to Pope Pius XI in 1851, and then they eventually, this was made public later on, 1871, I think it was. So.
But sometimes the Pope is not compelled to release that information to the public.
Right.
As we would hope to, but.
What about the content of these secrets? What do we really know about all of that? I think it has a lot of the sense is that the world is not doing well and that things are going badly and so on and so on. So maybe, what can we say about the content of the secret as it gradually became revealed? It seems to me that it was like the evils that'll beset the world in the last time, that there would be a lot of anti-clericalism, that priests would get denounced and so on, and especially against priests who were not living good lives. They were that was part of the whole thing. That there was a quote that I found in that book that says that priests who were leaving lives become cesspools of iniquity.
Oh my!
So you get really heavy language here. And also, I think the secret had to do with the vindication of the righteousness when Christ would send his angels to put to death all the persecutors of the church. Had a sort of biblical tinge to it. The beast will be defeated by Michael the archangel. The earth will be purified. God will be served.
That sounds like Revelation revisited.
Yeah, it sounds like the book of Revelations in the Bible. I think a lot of the imagery often is taken from that.
Although the apparitions from my reading of Sandra's book they're not the word of God either. And so those even have to be discerned, that those messages that come from the secrets need to be prayed over and not fatally subjected to. So.
To sort of complete this picture of these, what happens to these visionaries, Melanie died in 1904, and it says that Sandra says in her book that some groups still work for her canonization and to gain support for the secret that she had. Each one of them evidently had a sort of a unique secret that they were entrusted with by the Virgin Mary in these apparitions. Well, what else, Sue, do we want to say about this Lasalette phenomenon here? Oh, I know something that we missed in talking about it was that very often the topography or the terrain, the physical, natural setting has a role to play in all of this. And I think that part of where the Virgin had stood was on a rock, and it was a sort of broken rock. And for some people, were able to see the face of Christ on this rock.
Yes.
Now, this is a very common phenomenon. Again, we know with apparitions that there will be that kind of thing that everyone could see that in one way or another that comes to the sacred place that's been established.
And at that sacred place, which was Lasalette, is in the high French Alps, right near Grenoble. And I thought of the Winter Olympics when I was reading through that. Little did did probably many of the people know that had occurred so many years ago, but springs came forth from that vicinity, and of course among the cures were people who had smallpox were supposedly cleared there, eye diseases. There was one lady, I believe, who had a obstruction of some kind, and she drank the waters from the spring and was cured. She could drink and she could eat again. So, it does become a holy place that people can go to be strengthened or reconciled and in some ways cured. Although I would hope that at Lasalette, as in other places, that there is a healing and a conversion that happens within
the heart.
Yes, and that's a mini miracle or a major miracle, Jim.
You started to say once before you thought that Lasalette was really important as sort of a springboard to a lot of the other apparitions that occurred in the 19th and 20th century. It sort of set the tone. Many of the themes that you find in connection with Lasalette occur later on in Lourdes and in Fatima and at Medjugorje, other important sites of the apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
I very much see this as the launching pad. It's probably the one I knew the least about as I approached the Encountering Mary book, and I'm glad for it because it does put a context for me.
So we've been looking at the apparitions at Lasalette in 1846. Two shepherd children, Maximin and Melanie, only 15 and 11 years old, and that they see this vision. It's just a one-time kind of event for them. They have secrets in connection with it that they keep for a long time, don't want to tell people. They eventually tell the Pope, and it comes out gradually over a period of time. You have miracles connected with it, face of Christ appearing, the spring of water that's there. Again, very familiar elements in all of this. And then over a period of time, the local bishop saying, well, this is a credible kind of thing, and it's not essential to salvation or anything like that, but this is a credible kind of religious experience, and it's worthy of, as the term you use, human faith. Well, Sue, let's look a little bit at some aspect of Mary that comes forth as we look at this Lasalette phenomenon. I'd like to sort of look at it in terms of Mary as a maternal figure. I think there's some part of what the visionaries had to say had to do with the sort of God's anger at the world, and that God's upset with the sinfulness of the world, but that Mary is coming on now to play a very comforting and as I would say, maternal role. Of course, that's traditionally been our way of seeing Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Madonna figures that we're familiar with, and the crib scene that has shaped much of our consciousness of Mary with the baby at the crib. So the maternal figure of Mary, I think, is worth exploring here.
Right. The maternal side of Mary, when we think of mother, we do think of gentle, but we also think of one who gives guides, who shares truth. She did indicate to the children that she was trying to restrain the heavy hand of her son, so she certainly is a mediator or a mediatrix in that regard too. So where there is evil, she does not want it to persist, and she's willing to do what she can and to try to invest not only these two seers or visionaries, but other people to join ranks with her for the sake of purification, for the sake of fulfilling the will of God in each of their as well as each of our own lives. As we're situated right here, we can too hold hands with this marvelous mother, the mother of God, who's the mother of the church, who can be our mother, who's available to us if we so choose.
I think to pick up on that, there's a strong emotional side to these apparitions, including Lasalette from the 19th century and this maternal figure of Mary, where she is seen as one who is compassionate and caring for the people. In other words, often she is depicted in the apparitions as being sad, saddened over the situation in the world, over the sinfulness, over the fact that people are not living out their faith the way they should, that Catholics are not observing the ritual life of the church in as rigorous a fashion as ought to happen. So we get a sense of Mary's sadness. Again, it brings in an aspect of religion that is often missing. I mean, religion often becomes very cerebral natural and for some at least rational, and here we get a totally different side. Mary, the maternal figure who's sad over the existence of evil in the world and wants to comfort us and wants to help us to overcome it.
Right. At the same time, Mary knows that God has created us with free will, and we will choose the good, we will choose not to do the good. I think it was St. Therese of Lisieux, who's a French saint, who said before she died that she would spend her heaven doing good upon earth. Mm-hmm. And although we don't have Mary having said that from the time of her Assumption, I would think par excellence she is one who has opted to spend her heaven doing good upon earth.
Mm-hmm. That really fits in with this maternal image of Mary, the one who would never forget the people here and so on. And also, I suppose that theologically we'd place that in the context of our general sense of the communion of saints, that somehow we remain in relationship with the people who have died, who have gone before us, our loved ones, and really all people, that there's a essential solidarity with the human community, and that Mary represents that as continuing to be on our side as we would fight the evils in the world.
I do think her choice of the apparitions as are chosen is that bridge. I felt a comfort as well as a connection with Mary in a renewed way for myself by exploring this fine book.
Yeah, we're talking about this book, Encountering Mary, by Sandra Zimdar-Swartz. It is a study of the modern apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and very helpful, I think, in getting at some of these major themes. Well, Sue, we've been talking here about the vision of Mary at Lasalette in France back in 1846, and trying to talk a little bit about the secret entrusted, which had a very heavy character to it, but as you pointed out, always has a sense of hope that God is on our side in all of it. And then relating this to the maternal role of Mary. Mary, the one who cares about us, who is emotionally involved with us, and has great compassion for all of us. And so the apparitions have to do with religious experience, and there's ways in which everybody can begin to appreciate that.